Where was I? Oh, right. What happened after my first child was born? Well, what happened after my first child was born is that my relationship to my parents started to crumble. Right up until this point, I had been studying the Bible with one of their friends. I had done so for about a year, and I considered it my sort of final attempt to see what was going on in the Watchtower. It was my last attempt really to open myself up to it and hopefully start believing. Because at this point in my life, I was envious of what my parents had. I had never really seen the benefits of religious community before because I had never been exposed to it as a younger person. So now I had gotten a chance to see what happens within such an organization, and I wanted it. I thought the way they supported each other was awesome. I thought the way they were united by common beliefs and interests was awesome. And even though those were not my interests and my beliefs, I wanted something like that. I also wanted a good relationship with my parents. And as I said, I had witnessed lots of changes in their lives and in their personality and demeanor since they had converted to the truth. So I basically figured I would give it a shot. I would dive in, and I even made the express decision not to study with my parents, because my dad and I were very similar in some ways. And in the past, whenever we had tried to study the Bible together, it always turned into these big, nasty debates. Usually they would end with shouting and lots of anger, and on both of our parts, not just his. Because back then I used to take things very personally, and my dad used to trigger me a lot. We used to trigger each other a lot, to be quite honest. So whenever we would talk about the Bible or study the Bible, we'd always inevitably get into a debate, which would turn into an argument, which would turn into an all-out fight. So because I wanted to give it an honest try this time around, I started studying with one of their friends, and I did so for a year. And I studied the book of Daniel with him because he made the mistake of giving me choices. He said, we don't have to start with the first book. You already have studied the Bible. You already know quite a bit about it. So why don't we study what you want to study? And I was like, book of Daniel sounds interesting. And it was, and it is interesting. But basically at the end of that year of studying, my daughter was born. And I remember shortly before she was born, I was walking home from this guy's house, this guy who I was studying the Bible with, and I was desperate. I was like, I'm just going to pray. I mean, they always talked about praying and the power of prayer, so I decided, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. So I was walking down the street back to my house, and I started praying. I said, God, I really want to believe. I really, really want to believe. I want to be part of your organization because it seems so awesome. And because I love my parents, and I just, it would make my life so much easier if I could just believe, because I can't bring myself to do so. There's too many questions, too many doubts, too many inconsistencies. But I said, God, if you just show me your truth, I will forget about all of these things that are causing me to be hesitant, and I will be your loyal follower. So this is how I prayed, and then I just kind of waited. As I was walking, I was waiting for a sign, I was waiting for something, anything, to show me that this was indeed the truth. Now, of course, I saw nothing and I heard nothing, and shortly after this day, my daughter was born, and I discontinued my weekly Bible studies with this gentleman named Tom. Shout out to Tom. What a nice guy. I used to play squash with Tom. Every week we'd go play squash, then we'd go to his place, study the Bible for an hour. Sometimes we'd play chess together. Just a great guy, super nice. In any case, after I discontinued my studies, my daughter was born, and as I said, that's when things started to crumble with my parents and I. Not because I discontinued my study, but rather because they revealed themselves to be precisely the people they had been before baptism. And having worked closely with my dad for a number of years before this in the construction industry, I knew exactly what was going on. Because after my daughter was born, my dad became this hypercritical expert on parenting. Even though he only ever had one kid, you're looking at him. And even though he was hardly ever home because he was a workaholic and an alcoholic, you know, he treated me well. Don't get me wrong, I was never abused or taken advantage of or anything like that. My parents raised me with love. They gave me everything they could, everything they knew how to give. So don't think that I am criticizing my parents here, but I will not sugarcoat it. I will tell you the truth about them, and I will tell you the truth about my father specifically, because I feel that my mother is mostly just following him around, and this has always been the case. So maybe this is another reason the Jehovah's Witness belief system appeals to them, because, you know, he is the headship, the head of the family, and she is a meek, submissive wife who follows his lead. This was always the way they were, even when I was growing up before they converted, so it just made sense to them probably to keep that arrangement with their religion. So, in any case, my dad, let me give you the prognosis on him, okay? He is extremely clever for a man who has no education. He has practical intelligence. He figures things out very quickly on his own. And so because he has this cleverness, he extrapolates it. And he interprets it to mean that he's a genius in every field. I've seen my dad argue with a doctor before. My dad, who has no high school diploma, argue with a fucking doctor. And not because my dad did a bunch of research on a certain topic and he just happened to know a lot about it. No, because my dad knows everything, and he knows better than anyone else. And this, if you didn't figure it out yet, is one of my huge triggers with him, or it used to be. Because he would tell me his uninformed opinion as if it were fact, and I would immediately rally against that with my own brand of aggression. So after my daughter was born, my dad became hypercritical of my wife and I's parenting decisions, parenting styles. He questioned everything, from how tight we put the diapers on her to whether or not we should take her on vacation with us at 3 months, whether she was old enough to fly. And again, you have to remember, these are things that my parents have no clue about. My parents have no clue. They don't remember how tight a diaper's supposed to be. I'm the only baby they ever had, and I was in my 20s at this point. My parents don't know anything about taking babies on airplanes. They never took me on an airplane. They have no clue. But these are the types of things that they started being critical and judgmental about. And for me, as I said, I had already worked with my dad and I was already familiar with this side of him. You know, if you don't hammer the nails in the precise way that he wants you to, then you're doing it wrong. It doesn't matter that you can pound the nail in with 2 shots of the hammer. It makes no difference. You didn't do it his way, it's wrong. That's the way my dad is. I would come home from work with my dad and tell my wife stories about the fights that we got into and the big screaming matches, or I'd just be frustrated and I'd say, I'm fucking quitting this job. I don't want to work with him anymore. He's such a dick. So she saw this from the sidelines, but whenever we hung out with my parents, that's not the version of my dad that my wife got to know. So after my daughter was born, this was kind of my wife's first time seeing him for who he truly was. And she was hurt by this. She felt betrayed. And I, for my part, just felt defensive and protective of my wife. And so things started to get bad. I basically started telling my dad politely to fuck off. And he didn't like that. And I didn't care that he didn't like that. And things just started to break down in general. So this went on for probably a few years, I would say. Things getting worse and worse and worse. To the point where I decided to stage an intervention. My parents were over for dinner one night and I decided to try and force the conversation and force a resolution of some kind. I basically said, let's all just lay things out on the table. Let's talk about all the things that have hurt, the things that have offended. Let's make amends and let's move forward and go back to the way things used to be when we all got along relatively well. So we all sat at the table after dinner and we all hashed it out. My wife, myself, my mother. We cried, we apologized, we hugged. And then afterwards I was standing there with my dad while we were watching my daughter play, and I said, "How you doing? You didn't really talk a lot." And he said, "I'm fine." And I said, "Are you sure? You really didn't say a lot. I thought you'd have more to say. We're supposed to get it out. Like, did you get it out?" And my dad said, yeah, I got it out." So I was like, cool. Then I get to work the next day and I have an email in my inbox. And as it turns out, we weren't cool. My dad basically lied to my face. In his email, he said he has lots of issues, lots of problems, lots of grudges, and basically he just wasn't comfortable talking about it. So instead of telling me that, instead of saying, "Ollie, I'm not comfortable having this public conversation, can we just talk in private later," or something like that, he lied to my face, which is ironic considering, he follows the truth with a capital T, and apparently honesty is a big deal for them. So that was the moment I decided to scale back my relationship to my parents. By which I mean, instead of seeing them weekly, which was pretty much the way it had always been with us, I started to scale back. It started to be once every 2 weeks. And then as things continued to get worse, it was once a month. So things just kept getting worse and worse. But it wasn't until I started waking up. It wasn't until I had my cubicle epiphany, as I like to call it, that things really started to get interesting. Because up until that point, I had no beliefs of my own. And I still had respect for the Jehovah's Witnesses and their beliefs. And even though it wasn't my thing, I still felt some admiration for, aspects of their beliefs. Not all of their beliefs, but certain aspects. But then the spring of 2013 rolled around. I was sitting at my cubicle minding my own business, working, thinking, contemplating some question or some idea of some sort, when I had this breakthrough moment. I followed my thoughts to a place beyond thinking. And that's one of the only ways I can fully describe this experience. I was thinking about these really big questions about human nature and the state of the world and politics. And all of a sudden I broke through the brush. Imagine somebody making their way through dense forest and hacking through the undergrowth and pushing branches aside, and then all of a sudden they break through, boom, and they're in a big huge clearing. Whereas before all they could see were trees, now all of a sudden it's vast, it's wide open, and indescribable. And that's kind of what happened to me. Some people call it an awakening. To me, that implies that you're now fully awake, which is, in my experience, untrue. So I like to refer to it as a wake-up call, because it's kind of like when the alarm goes off and you're still half asleep, but you're starting to wake up. And that's where I'm at now. I'm waking up. I'm not awake. I'm not woke, but I am waking up. I'm not sleeping anymore. I'm certainly not dreaming anymore. So I think I feel good about where I'm at. But so after I started waking up, I became interested in spirituality and religion. Not because I was interested in joining an organized religion, but because I was trying to figure out what had happened to me that day, and also what was continually happening to me each and every day afterwards, because this wasn't a one and done type of thing. I would say the initial experience lasted at least 2 months. 2 months of waking up every day feeling like I was on ecstasy, like just pure bliss. It was amazing. And it faded a little bit, but luckily by the time it had faded, I'd started doing research. I'd started studying Stoic philosophy and understanding the relationship between my thinking, my feeling, and my doing. And this was crucial for me. The moment I read Marcus Aurelius, like one of the first, passages that hit me was about this notion that everything is perspective and everything is opinion. And if you change your opinion, you change the way you perceive the world. It's that simple. And it really was that simple. And it really is that simple. It happens to me every day. So afterwards, I started studying philosophy and psychology, because obviously what was happening to me was internal. It was mental or psychological and not physical. And I also eventually started studying spiritual traditions. After experiencing this wake-up call and after learning a little bit more and expanding my interests, I realized that I had a really good resource at my disposal. Because I studied Stoic philosophy extensively. I studied the Tao Te Ching and the works of Zhuangzi, which is Taoism. I studied Vedantic philosophy, which is the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita of India. And I realized Jesus Christ probably had similar insights and similar wisdom to share with me. And I was like, who better to ask than my Father? Who better to ask than my Father? So I said, Dad, I've been interested in learning more about Jesus and some of the lessons that he taught. And I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to get together and talk about spiritual things. And he accepted. I said, but there's one condition, Dad. I don't want to hear about the Old Testament. I don't want to read about it. I don't, if the conversation goes there, I really would appreciate it if we brought it back to the topic of the New Testament and what Jesus taught. I basically told my dad, listen, there are these great teachers throughout history that have come around and that have changed the way we look at the world. And I've been learning about them. And one of these great teachers is Jesus. And I have not learned about him yet, and I would like to learn about him with you. So that was kind of like my sales pitch. And I thought it would be interesting, maybe have some conversations with him and pick out some of the parallels and the similarities that I had discovered in my own research. Because I had ulterior motives. I wanted to show him that there was nothing unique about Jesus. There was nothing unique about the Jehovah's Witnesses. There was nothing unique about what they believed. And in fact, the best parts of their beliefs could be found in a wide range of traditions, some of which predate Christianity, some of which arose in parallel without contact with Christianity. So I was trying to plant some seeds, obviously. I was trying to get some doubts into his head. But ultimately, I would have just been happy to learn more about Jesus and to read things like the Sermon on the Mount, which I hadn't read at the time, or to dive into the book of John, which is the mystical gospel. Another book I haven't read yet. I would really like to, because, in the beginning there was the Word. And the Word is the Logos, my friends, the Logos of the Stoics. So the book of John was heavily inspired by the Hellenic philosophies and the mystery schools that were around in Rome and Greece at the time. So, this is a topic of great interest for me. And I wanted to study it with my dad. So we gave it a shot. We had 2 sessions, and I'll tell you about those in part 3 of the Watchtower Saga, because I got to get my ass to work. But thanks for joining me, and don't forget to live well, because what else are you going to do?